The iron gates of Blackwell Asylum closed with a sound so heavy it seemed to travel through Eleanor Whitby's body and settle in her chest. It was not merely a noise but a declaration, a final sentence pronounced without appeal. The carriage that had brought her there did not linger. She watched it roll away through the fog, the silhouette of her husband disappearing with it, his duty complete. The ink on the commitment papers would still be drying, the words hysterical, melancholic, unfit already enough to erase her voice, her will, her past. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp stone mixed with sharp antiseptic that burned the nostrils. Gas lamps lined the corridor, their flames flickering as if unsure whether to remain alive in such a place. Eleanor's boots echoed weakly against the floor as an attendant led her forward, his grip firm but not cruel, practiced in the way one handles livestock. On either side of the corridor, heavy wooden doors stood closed, each marked with a small metal plaque. From behind them came sounds that made her heart race, low sobs, sudden laughter that broke into choking silence, the rhythmic thud of someone striking the door again and again until exhaustion won. She tried to speak, to ask how long she would be there, what she was expected to do, but the words caught in her throat. Every instinct told her that questions were dangerous here. They stopped before a small room with bare walls and a single high window barred with iron. In the center stood a wooden chair bolted to the floor, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Thick leather straps hung from its arms, legs, and backrest, stiff with age and darkened by sweat and something Eleanor did not want to name. Her stomach tightened. "This will help settle you," the attendant said in a neutral tone, as if describing a cup of tea. She resisted then, weakly, instinctively, and the resistance was enough. Two nurses entered, their faces stern and detached. Eleanor was pushed down into the chair, her skirt bunched awkwardly as straps were pulled tight around her wrists. The leather bit into her skin. Her ankles were secured next, then her chest, the strap drawn so snugly that she had to consciously slow her breathing to avoid panic. When she cried out, a nurse leaned close, her voice sharp and low, warning her that noise was a sign of agitation. The door closed, leaving Eleanor alone with the chair and the dim light. At first she tried to count the seconds, to anchor herself to time, but the stillness swallowed her efforts. Her arms began to ache, then throb. Pins and needles spread through her fingers, turning into numbness that frightened her more than pain. Her back protested against the unyielding wood, muscles trembling from the effort of holding herself upright. She begged then, quietly at first, then louder when no one answered. Her throat grew raw. Tears ran down her face and soaked into her collar. The straps did not loosen. Her body betrayed her in small humiliations, tremors, shallow gasps, the creeping terror that she might faint and never wake again. When at last the door opened, relief flooded her so intensely it made her dizzy. But relief was brief. She was unstrapped and nearly collapsed, her legs unable to support her weight. Hands caught her under the arms and dragged her down another corridor to a room where a large wooden tub waited. Steam did not rise from it. The water lay still and dark, reflecting the ceiling like a black mirror. Eleanor understood before she was told. They called it cold immersion, a corrective measure for excited nerves and disobedient thoughts. Eleanor was lifted and lowered into the tub inch by inch. The first contact stole her breath. The cold was not sharp but crushing, a force that seemed to squeeze her from the outside in. Her lungs seized as if refusing to work. She screamed, and the sound echoed horribly off the tiled walls. Attendants pressed her shoulders down, ensuring she could not climb out. The water lapped at her chin, her teeth chattering so violently she feared they would shatter. Her skin burned and numbed at the same time, a contradiction that confused her senses. Panic flooded her mind, thoughts dissolving into pure animal terror. She could not think of prayers, of loved ones, of anything but the overwhelming need to escape. A doctor stood nearby, observing, his notebook balanced casually in one hand. He noted her reaction, her pulse, the way her body shook, murmuring something about progress and balance. To him, she was not a woman but a condition to be managed. When they finally pulled her out, her limbs felt like they belonged to someone else. She was wrapped in coarse blankets that scratched her raw skin and left shivering on a narrow bed in a ward lined with iron-framed cots. Around her lay other women, some staring blankly at the ceiling, others rocking gently as if to soothe an unseen wound. No one spoke. As night crept in, the gas lamps dimmed, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls like reaching hands. Eleanor lay awake, her body aching, her mind replaying every moment of the day with cruel clarity. She realized then that the punishment was not designed to heal her thoughts or restore her spirit. It was meant to break her resistance, to teach her silence, to mold her into something manageable. In the darkness, another scream echoed down the corridor, abruptly cut short. Eleanor pressed her face into the thin pillow and understood with devastating certainty that this place did not exist to save women like her. It existed to erase them quietly, behind locked doors, where suffering could be labeled treatment and cruelty could wear the comforting disguise of care. Months passed in Blackwell Asylum without ceremony or marker, each day bleeding into the next until Eleanor could no longer remember the exact sound of freedom. The seasons changed outside. She knew this only because the drafts through the stone corridors grew sharper, then damp, then briefly warm again, but inside, time was frozen in routine and obedience. She learned quickly that survival depended on stillness. The women who argued, who wept too loudly, who begged to be heard were the ones taken away and returned altered, or not returned at all. Eleanor had become careful. Her movements were measured, her voice soft and brief. She answered questions with what the doctors wished to hear, nodded when instructed, and learned to lower her eyes when passing attendants. Even so, the asylum did not forget its power over her. It reminded her daily, quietly, relentlessly. Her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the wash basin startled her one morning. The woman staring back looked older than her years, her face pale and hollowed, her hair crudely shorn close to the scalp. Vanity, the matron had said, encouraged delusions. Eleanor touched the rough ends of her hair and felt a sharp grief, not for beauty, but for the self she had been before it was taken. The wards were filled with whispers, though speaking was forbidden. Information traveled in glances, in the tightening of hands, in the sudden stillness that fell when footsteps approached. Eleanor learned of the punishments through these silent warnings. The dark cells below the main building. The chairs that spun until the world dissolved. The isolation that broke minds more effectively than any blow. One evening, as lamps flickered low, Eleanor made a mistake. A young girl in the next bed, no more than 16, committed for refusing a marriage arranged by her family, began to sob quietly into her blanket. Something in the sound pierced Eleanor's carefully constructed calm. She leaned closer and whispered words of comfort, barely audible, meant only to steady the girl's breathing. The whisper was enough. An attendant appeared as if summoned by the sound itself. Eleanor was pulled from her bed before she could speak, her arms gripped firmly, her slippers scraping the stone floor. The girl's sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by terrified silence. Eleanor did not resist. Resistance only prolonged things. They took her down a narrow staircase she had never seen before. Each step descended into colder air, heavier with damp and decay. The gas lamps grew fewer, their light weaker, until shadows swallowed most of the walls. At the bottom, iron doors lined a short corridor. One of them opened with a groan that made Eleanor's stomach clench. The cell inside was barely large enough for her to stand. The walls were rough stone, wet to the touch, and the air was stale, unmoving. There was no window, no lamp, no bench, nothing but darkness waiting to close in. She was pushed inside, the door slammed shut, and a bolt slid into place with a final, echoing sound. At first, Eleanor stood still, afraid to move, afraid of losing her sense of direction in the pitch-black space. The darkness was absolute, so complete it felt physical, pressing against her eyes. Slowly, she lowered herself to the floor, drawing her knees to her chest. The cold seeped through her thin dress and into her bones. Time unraveled. Without light or sound, minutes stretched into something vast and formless. Eleanor tried to mark the passing hours by her own breathing, by the ache in her limbs, by the hunger that slowly sharpened into pain. Sometimes water arrived through a narrow slot in the door, sometimes it did not. Food was rare, irregular, as if even basic needs were part of the experiment. In the darkness, her mind began to betray her. She heard footsteps that never came, voices that whispered her name, her husband's voice calling from far away. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sounds seemed to come from inside her skull. Shapes formed in the blackness when she closed her eyes, faces, twisting and dissolving, watching her. She began to speak aloud, at first to reassure herself, then simply to hear a human voice. Her words echoed strangely off the stone, sounding cousin distant. When exhaustion overtook her, she slept in short, broken bursts, waking in terror, unsure where she was or how long she had been there. When the door finally opened, the sudden light burned her eyes. Hands dragged her out, her legs trembling, barely able to support her weight. She was returned to the ward thinner, quieter, and visibly changed. The doctors observed her closely in the days that followed, noting her withdrawn manner, her vacant stares, her tendency to flinch at sudden sounds. They decided her condition had worsened. The next treatment was called rotational therapy. Eleanor was taken to a room where a chair hung suspended from the ceiling by chains. She was strapped in tightly, wrists, ankles, chest, and head secured so she could not move. At first, the chair turned slowly. The room spun gently around her, disorienting but manageable. Then the speed increased. The world blurred into streaks of light and shadow. Her stomach lurched violently, nausea overwhelming her senses. She cried out, but her voice dissolved into the spinning air. The motion erased all sense of up and down, of beginning and end. When the chair finally stopped, Eleanor vomited weakly onto the floor, her body limp, her mind fractured into fragments she could not reassemble. After that, she learned to be invisible. Years passed. Eleanor's release came quietly, without apology or explanation. She was declared improved, manageable, no longer a disturbance. The gates opened, and she stepped out into a world that felt unreal in its openness and noise. People moved freely, spoke loudly, laughed without fear of punishment. It overwhelmed her. She carried no chains, no visible scars, yet the asylum lived on inside her. In cold water, she felt the grip of unseen hands. In darkness, she remembered the stone walls closing in. Even in silence, she listened for footsteps. The Victorian asylum had claimed to cure her, but its true legacy was fear etched into memory. Eleanor survived not because she was healed, but because she learned how completely a human spirit could be broken, and still forced to walk back into the light, carrying its shadows forever.